Welcome to Done with Debauchery, a podcast hosted by Denise and Keisha, two friends who share intimate conversations about alcohol and drug use, struggling with sobriety, and our personal paths to wellness. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Done with Debauchery. I'm Denise, and I'm here with my co-host, Keisha.
Hi.
Today we're going to be chatting about addiction replacement. Behavior that tends to happen when you remove one of your addictive substances out of your life. 65% of people have addictive tendencies with more than one thing. I don't want to just say substance because I think we can have addictions to things like work, sex, gambling, social media. The list literally is endless. Addictions often jump from one thing to the other, and that's because a lot of psychological and physical addictions are about meeting an emotional need or reducing the discomfort of an experienced emotion.
And all these things have one major factor in common. They're dopamine drivers. So we have this area of our brain that's considered a reward center, and that's where something called dopamine is being released from. And this is a response to pleasurable experiences, and it's really closely tied to your memory and your motivation behind certain actions. So essentially, you are setting up a pleasure pathway in your brain, and your brain remembers what made it feel that way. And this becomes strongly correlated with addiction. Essentially, the more you're repeating an action that is giving you that dopamine hit, the more you're going to have to repeat it in order to get that same level of satisfaction.
I think you just clearly explained what it's like to create a pleasure pathway. And I fully agree that once you start to groove and establish these pleasure pathways in your brain, they become very strong and powerful. And just, the substance that you needed today doesn't give you the same hit tomorrow. And this is where you start to build tolerance. And I think, what you've outlined also just really goes to show that addiction is a complex brain disease. It doesn't stop when you remove the substance. Your body is still going to be looking for creative ways to try and fill that dopamine void if you remove alcohol. You may start smoking weed, you may start gambling, you may end up eating a lot of sugar, which is me.
And even in our first episode, we joked that we're essentially Cali sober. We're not drinking, but we are doing edibles, and we were just essentially in a way replacing that glass of rosé with another substance that is gonna take us out of our bodies.
Yeah, I've had a lot of behaviors that, I've had, I think, very much under wraps show up or just be more prevalent in my life since removing alcohol. And I do feel like this has been consistent for me every single time that I've got sober. So some of the things that come up for me is weed, being that Cali sober. I generally, when I'm drinking, barely ever smoke weed or do edibles, and my drive towards that behavior when I'm sober becomes quite consistent. I have a really difficult time with food. Sugar specifically becomes something that I'm really always after, and I'm looking for gummy bears or actual real sweets,
Refined sugar.
Not an apple, guys. I find I'm really drawn to shop more, and even the scrolling on social media for me becomes a way more consistent, and I find myself picking up my phone and mindlessly scrolling way more than I would be otherwise.
I feel the same, and for me, I feel like I'm so used to numbing out and just avoiding my emotions. So when I am alcohol free or totally sober, it's really hard for me to just like sit and be by myself. So I'm often reaching for sugar 100%. And I feel like that's something I've done my whole life. I've always loved sugar as a kid. What kid doesn't? But in high school, I lived off sugar. And that's, I feel like, only escalated as I've gone through adulthood. Like I get such a pleasurable feeling like from consuming sugar. Shopping is a huge one for me. And I would say people, like filling up with people, like going on dating apps and just trying to find some sort of connection outside of myself.
Yeah, and I think Gabor Mate has a really famous term, and it's like that hungry ghost syndrome. And what it feels like for me is that, I remove one substance that I have been psychologically leaning on to kind of like fill this void, and then I am like filling up on all these other substances. But even with like the primary addiction or substance, like when I overconsume all of these things, it's a hungry ghost. Like I absolutely never get full. I just like look to the next thing. And because right now I really am still, I think, psychologically missing alcohol, when I'm popping to all these other addictive like coping mechanisms that I'm using to kind of like get over that void of the alcohol, I'm never feeling full. Like I feel like I could endlessly eat gummy bears right now, also order 52 different outfits, and scroll social media and like all at the same time, and I would still feel unfulfilled.
I feel like I am doing all of those things. But yeah, definitely the same for me. And like it's like that feeling of like never being fully satisfied. Like, yes, I'm eating this piece of pizza, but I'm not hungry for it. I'm hungry for like that feeling that it gives me of like comfort and like satisfaction that is just like continuously unattainable and feels like so much farther out of my reach the more I engage in these behaviors. I feel like the more sugar I eat, the more shit I order, the more I'm needing to try and still feel satisfied. And that final feeling of like contentment never comes.
Yeah, and I think a few things that come up for me there. It's like, I think when you're also using like a replacement addiction, you're like chasing the dopamine high that you would get for something like alcohol or cocaine. That's something that would be very powerful, versus like you probably only get a small hit of dopamine from shopping. So like how many things do you need to buy to equal cocaine? Probably a lot, or maybe just a few pairs of Manolo Blahniks. I'm not sure, but it's definitely not an Aritzia shirt.
And I wonder if like the experience of actually like purchasing something and attaining it, like it's perceived differently by your body and your brain than actually ingesting something like sugar or alcohol or drugs. Like, does it light up your brain the same way?
Well, I think yeah, some substances or things probably are more powerful than others, but that might be unique to the person. I guess for me, like when I think of shopping, like even though, yeah, I do find it pleasurable and clearly it's something that I like to do, like to replace the void, but I don't think it's giving me the same removal or temporary relief the way that like drugs and alcohol do. And I even think with like sometimes using weed, because I think there's a difference to using weed socially as a form of enjoyment. But when it starts to be used as a coping mechanism, I think that's for me is when I need to start to look at what I'm truly doing with that replacement behavior.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And just like the idea of like everyone has their vices. So when you mentioned gambling earlier, like that honestly wasn't even on my radar as something that would be used as an addiction, but like we know it is so commonly. But I think of like when I went to Niagara Falls like a couple years ago and like went to the casino, I literally pulled out $20, used it on the quarter slots, and like when that was done, I was already like shaking, like I need another $20. I'm not winning anything, but I do get that like that impulse action, and it really has nothing to do with what I'm actually doing. It's coming from me and whatever I can latch onto.
Yeah, like I know people that are heavily addicted to gambling, and I guess the only thing I can relate to, like winning a lot of money would be just like large accomplishments and work. And I know that in and of itself can be addictive, of like always wanting to achieve more. And I know actually a lot of athletes can be like that as well, where they want to like run faster or get first place, and like those types of
First
things.
place?
I don't know. Like, you know what I mean though? Like, I think there's people that like are into very competitive athletic sports where no matter what they're achieving, if they run, let's say, the New York Marathon, and you know their time is very good, like it's still not good enough. They're like after the next race.
Yeah.
And I think that's very much that hungry ghost. It's like you buy the shirt, but like after you bought the shirt, you're like already off looking for the next thing. It's never enough. And you know what? I can even relate that to my drinking behavior, because it's like I have one or two drinks and it's not enough. And then once I have some drinks, then I want cocaine. Like I'm always like wanting more of whatever my experience is. Like I'm like chasing this feeling that feels slightly out of reach, which is going to be like, I don't know, safety, relief, freedom from whatever is going on for me in the present. And I think it's very much a lack of acceptance of being able to be in the present moment.
Yeah, and I love what you said, that like it's out of reach, and like it remains out of reach.
It's like a carrot dangling in front of your face.
Except I'm not reaching for the carrot. We actually just had carrots.
I'd like to back up to something that you said though in the beginning about always like really loving candy when you were younger, because when you were telling that story, like obviously in my mind a few things came up. Was number one, you were already training your brain to be susceptible to addiction because you were lighting up and creating the same pleasure pathways that lights up these addictive tendencies. So it's really interesting that, you know, we don't have, like, you know, we feed sugar to all of our kids, probably not knowing that what you're doing is increasing the possibility of these like addictive tendencies later in life.
And we are totally taught to associate sugar with celebrations. We're having birthday cake, cupcakes.
Good job, here's a candy.
Yeah, or like even like when you're going through a breakup, like the classic like movie scene is the girl on the couch drinking wine and eating ice cream.
What are bonbons? Does anyone know?
Bonbon is, I think, French candy.
Yeah, gross.
They're like hard candy.
I'll take anything actually right now. Bring them over.
But yeah, going back to that, like we are taught from like such an early age that like sugar equals celebration, like alcohol equals celebration, and like it is just ingrained into like our daily habits on so many levels. To
reach outside of yourself, like you're not feeling good, so go ahead, like have some candy, like make yourself feel better. I feel like my parents also often used to always offer treats. Like food treats,
like bribes?
as a way of, well, yes, as bribes for sure. Like, go practice piano and then you can have this. But also like instead of like if I was sad or upset, like I would get given like cookies or treats or something like that to like try to make myself feel better. So like I was also conditioned to use food as a soothing mechanism from a really young age. And I think a lot of people also have that conditioning.
Yeah, and I think that carries on into adulthood as like that like treat yourself mentality that is so ingrained in our society that like if you've had a hard day, like, you know what, like you deserve that glass of wine, like you deserve to buy that bag, like just thinking that these things, again, like outside of ourselves, are going to make us feel better in these moments.
Agreed. And I think we're kind of talking about a fine line here, because overall, even though that, you know, I can see some addiction replacement kind of showing up in my life right now, it overall seems less harmful than, you know, the consistent binge drinking and other substances were causing me. So at what point do you feel like you need to start looking at these replacement addictions versus calling something harm reduction? Like, where's the line in that for you?
I mean, I feel like I'm at that line right now, like with at least how I'm like consuming sugar and shopping, but like it's hard to say, right? Because like is having sugar at night keeping me sober from alcohol? Like very likely. And I think that like a lot of like the non-alcoholic drinks that I'm enjoying like in the evening, also like the ones that are fake wine also do have like a high content of sugar, which is just fueling that pleasure pathway as well. So it might be very hard for me to cut back, but yeah, how long can I maintain this? I honestly don't know until I have no more skin on my forehead. It's all zits.
Also me, except for it's on my chin. Yeah, and I think at some point you have to really ask yourself the tough question, especially I think when you're dealing with like this emotional avoidance that kind of runs through it, is like, are you just avoiding the inevitable of what you have to deal with further? Like, and what is procrastinating that really doing for you? Because I also feel like I'm at that line, and I'm also questioning, like, is the sugar actually better for me than the way that I was drinking? Like, I don't actually know all the time if the answer is yes. And I guess it depends on how far you take it and how much of it you're having and what's going on. But my bigger concern is that, you know, if I'm scrolling social media way more, or I'm having a weed gummy here and there, or I'm like endlessly eating sugar, I'm still not feeling my best. I'm not living up to my potential. But the bigger concern is that I'm still avoiding and running from whatever it was that like that need or that emotional fulfillment that I'm like looking to fill. So at what point do you decide that you're stable enough from that primary addiction to maybe start really kind of tackling and breaking down all these other little things that are popping up?
And I think that you have to listen to your body. Like, it tells you how it feels when you put different things inside of it. Like, that sounds like a little raunchy. But, like, honestly, like, your body doesn't lie. Like, for me, when I eat sugar, like, I do break out. I get bloated. I have shitty sleeps if I eat a full pizza, like, the night before. But it's, like, long term, like, are those physical things gonna be better for me than drinking a bottle of wine a night by myself? Like, for me, the answer is yes. Like, I would rather have these other sort of substitutes and gradually make change with those. Like, try and like set a limit. Like, I'm not gonna buy anything this week or next week, but still letting myself have sugar, but in smaller doses. And I think we have really kind of like narrowed in on like sugar being like the main replacement that we're using for our addictions, but this is like applicable to anything.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I feel like right now things feel like super out of sorts for me. Like I've always been a very healthy eater. So I just feel actually at this present moment like worse as a result almost of some of the like replacement behaviors that I feel like I'm experiencing. And even though like I know scrolling social media gives me anxiety and like just overall makes me like is terrible for my mental health, I don't feel unable to stop those things. Like it almost feels like a little out of control and spinny, like the same way that sometimes my alcohol consumption does. And so I don't know. It's difficult for sure.
It's really hard. Like making meaningful change in whatever aspect is not easy, but I do think there's value in also taking breaks from social media. Like if you can't stop scrolling, like I often temporarily deactivate my account, whether that's for like a week, a month, 3 months, and it's hard. I miss it. And like I do like find myself spending time on other social media platforms, but like if you don't have control over the behavior, like I think that you should not be doing it. And the one thing that I feel like I know for sure is like regardless of how shitty I'm feeling today, the only thing that I know 100% was that if I add alcohol, it's just going to make it worse. Like, yeah, and maybe not that night, like maybe I'll feel great, but like in the long term, like, and I think we talked about this like in our moderation episode, is like playing the tape till the end.
Yeah, we can all tell I'm only hanging on by a very thin thread at this point.
But that's okay. Like some days are harder than others, some weeks are harder than others, and I think it's just constantly having these conversations with me, with yourself. Like, what are the things you know for sure? Like, if you have a glass of wine today, what is that going to look like in a month?
And I think the other thing that's like important to kind of note here is that I feel like I had multiple addictive coping mechanisms going on at one time anyway. Like, it wasn't like all of a sudden I removed one and there was like this snowball of things that happened. And maybe there was a few that popped up that like sugar and
or
like,
were amplified once you cut out alcohol.
Yeah, but you know, I do feel like there were those tendencies of those replacement behaviors there that had ebbed and flowed out of my life historically. So it wasn't like they were like totally new, popped out of the woods, like shockingly showed up.
Yeah, none of these actions are a surprise. And I feel the same way. Like, when I was drinking, I was also consuming sugar and like food that didn't make me feel good. I was still fair. Shopping like outside of like more than what I need, essentially. Like, I was still like going on dating apps and like trying to like create connections with people that maybe otherwise I wouldn't have if I was in a better place.
That was a really PG way of explaining that.
My mom listens to this.
Creating connections. No, but then I think, you know, is our expectations of ourselves realistic in a Western modern world? Like, you know, so many things are set up to be addictive. Like, you know, the flavors they create on potato chips are literally created to make you want to be addicted and eat more. And so is social media. Like, I mean, we've all watched the documentary on like the way that it affects people. So how do you get out of this like addiction spiral fully, but still live in a
society?
Because, you know, it's like, are you going to be free from a coffee addiction or caffeine? Like, can you?
We haven't even talked about coffee yet.
But I think what's important here as well is to say that I don't feel like all of a sudden I have developed like a gambling addiction where I've never been interested in gambling prior, but other things that I had used previously have either increased in use or kind of taken over the replacement for alcohol.
And I think that what that means is that, like, we're not necessarily addressing the root cause of our addictive behaviors. Like, maybe we're starting to, and, like, we're on that journey still. But I think that if we were free of all of our trauma and our history of whatever that brought us here, like, we wouldn't be acting in this way.
Yeah, I think that's fair to assume. It's like you really got to get to the bottom of the emotional need, and really kind of like do the work around what's that's driving.
Yeah, the why.
It's possibly a life process.
For sure. So I guess the key takeaway from this episode is that sugar is delicious.
So are weed gummies.
But really, once you create these pleasure pathways in your brain, they're not going to be undone overnight. You may find yourself replacing your primary addiction with other behaviors, and that is something to be aware of. Keep showing up for yourself and working on making meaningful change in your life. It is possible. This is Keisha and Denise signing off on another episode of Done With Debauchery. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, please share and subscribe. You can also find us on Instagram at Done With Debauchery. See you next time.